Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it a minute here and then we'll get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for another Ohio Chamber of Commerce Business Academy lunch webinar. We have I think, a very interesting topic in these capital budgets. When I spoke to Brian, he said, "Oh yeah, I can fill an hour." So this we found the right speaker, I think. For those of you out there that don't know Brian Perera, he serves as Senior Policy Advisor at ZHF Consulting. But before that, he began his career in the state Senate, served under 6 state Senate presidents, 9 finance committee chairs, and he was the Senate finance director. So he obviously knows a bit about this capital budget process. So in 2014, then he went off and joined The Ohio State University as associate vice president for their state relations team. And now he's back here on Cap Square with us all. So Brian, I'll let you take it from there. And I look forward to a good presentation on where we are in the capital budget. And
very good. And Tony, if people have questions during the course of this, they can text them into you, and we can kind of hit those at the end. So
okay, good.
The capital bill is kind of the mystery budget nobody really understands on Cap Square. So let me kind of back up a little. As Tony mentioned, I was the finance director for the state Senate for about 20 plus years. And as a result of that, I got to work on all of the appropriation bills that the General Assembly enacted. So, this is the one where it deals with bricks and mortar construction. So if you think about the state's budget cycle, it's a 2-year period of time. It starts with the operating budget, which happened at the beginning of last year. We're now living with House Bill 33. That was the main operating bill. There's a transportation budget that does road works and that type of thing. That was House Bill 23. There's also a workers' comp budget, an industrial commission budget. There used to be a tobacco master settlement budget back in the day. This is none of those. And it's important to know that, because a lot of the spending that people seem to care about at the state level happens in those bills. So this is the capital budget. And, before I even start into what the heck the capital budget contains and how much money might get spent, I want to just explain what the word in this context, capital, means. C-A-P-I-T-A-L. That is not capital referring to the capital city or the seat of government. It is not the capital spelled with an O that refers to the group of buildings where government functions are carried out, like Capitol Square. Capital in this case just refers to assets that are owned or controlled by the government. So state buildings is what you should think of this as. And immediately, I'm sure there are people who are thinking, well, doesn't the state spend more, money on things other than state buildings in this capital budget? Yes, they do. So I will explain that. So to give you an idea of how, if I can get my screen to share properly here, what does the state spend money on over the course of this 2-year budget period? Hopefully, you are now seeing a document, and Tony, or if somebody can confirm that they're actually seeing a document from LSC on their screen, I hope. If this works.
Yes, I did.
There you go.
We have it.
So, Legislative Service Commission, the nonpartisan arm of the legislature that puts together bills and does fiscal work for them, at the end of every fiscal year puts together, okay, what did the state actually spend money on last year? So FY23, which was the last completed fiscal year, you can see the state spent money, almost $88 billion in the operating components of the state, which is, running state agencies and that sort of thing. Little over nearly 4.2 billion on transportation, capital, which we'll get back into in a minute, and then the amount of money that funds the workers' comp agency to oversee injured workers. So, when we talk about the capital budget, it is not the biggest budget that the state has, but it takes up most of the oxygen in this second year of the General Assembly, because the operating budget gets done the previous year, the capital budget usually gets done the second year. So you can see there in FY23, there was, a little over $1 billion spent in what we would consider non-transportation capital spending. So, $94 billion of your tax dollars at work there. It's kind of important to, take note of that sort of thing, because it's an awful lot of money. The capital budget, like I said, is usually enacted in even numbered calendar years. And I'll explain why I'm saying usually in a few minutes, because we're hoping this goes off as you would expect in the next few months, but that could be delayed for various reasons. So what's contained in this thing? It's all of the bricks and mortar expenses that the state spends on vertical construction, things like renovation, construction, repair, demolition. Sometimes it involves purchase of land, that sort of thing. Colleges, public universities, school districts, DAS spends money on buildings, that sort of thing. And you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, I hear a lot of other things get funded in there that people care about that are called community projects. Yes, more on that later. And I know that's why most people are listening, because, they want to get funded community projects. And I understand that. So I'll get to that in much more detail in a moment. So in general, funding for things like state highways and bridges, those are done in the transportation budget, not in this bill. So not a lot of road work would be considered a capital budget project, even though those are definitely capital expenses. So the other thing that's important to know about the capital budget, unlike the operating budget, which is funded with tax money, the taxes we pay in income, sales, tobacco, commercial activity, things of that sort, most of the money in a capital budget is the state issuing bonds. And, that's simply the state goes out on the market, people purchase the bonds to get the returns on them. The proceeds of those bonds are used for capital expenses, and then the state pays them off over a period of time, usually 20 years. So that becomes important shortly, because the state has constitutional limitations on what it's allowed to spend bond money on. With state tax dollars, they can spend it pretty much as the General Assembly sees fit. With capital appropriations, there are constitutional and statutory limitations that come along with that. So months before the introduction of the capital budget, and to be honest, I think Tony and I both thought the capital budget would be introduced by the time this little talk occurred, and it has not been yet. So sorry about that. A lot of planning goes on, and usually the state puts together a 6-year capital improvements plan. That plan gets updated every 2 years by the Governor's Office of Budget and Management. It's based on recommendations from the state agencies. So at some point last summer, after the General Assembly and Governor approved the operating budget, they started work in the executive branch on the capital plan, and tried to decide, all right, what do our agencies need? What are we going to spend money on? And we know there will be a community project component of this, which again is not out there yet, but we will talk about that in a moment. I'm going to a screen here to share an OBM document with you. And of course, it is not coming up on my screen. Well, I will just explain what they do then. So when OBM puts together their plan, usually they have to stay within a certain amount of a debt limitation, because our Constitution in Ohio says that you can't have a capital outlay that costs more than 5% in debt service of what your operating budget is. And every month or so, the OBM puts out a document showing, well, how much are we spending on debt service right now? As of March of this year, we are spending estimated 2.65% of our operating budget on debt service. We're well below the 5% debt limit. So that means a capital budget can go out as normal. They don't have to worry about hitting the debt ceiling. So that's good news for those of us who like the capital budget bill. So, as with operating budgets, budget management looks at the submissions that are made by the state agencies and sends a preliminary capital budget recommendation to the governor. My expectation is they probably did that a few months ago. And then what happens is a little bit different than most other bills that get worked on in Cap Square. The governor's office and legislative leadership will come together and try to finalize a proposal for a capital budget prior to introduction. Sometimes us old timers on Capitol Square call this a conference committee in advance because, unlike other bills that get amended dozens of times in the process, the operating budget bill, for example, was amended almost 2,000 times with substitute bills and omnibus amendments, that sort of thing. The attempt of this in the capital world is to say, here's what we're spending on the state agencies, here's what we're going to spend in community project funding, and okay, we've agreed, let's just pass this, not have any amendments, and get this done in an expedient fashion. It would be nice if that is what ends up occurring, but at the moment, this year anyway, that has not been, what's been going on. And the reason for that is the House and Senate set different dates for their capital submission process. The House date was sometime in January, February. The Senate date for capital requests from their members is April 22nd, so still coming up. They have not exactly decided on that yet. So again, that's why we haven't seen a bill get introduced yet. So when the bill gets introduced, sometimes it has reappropriations in it, which is a weird term. What does reappropriations mean? Spell check does not recognize this word yet. In Ohio, our Constitution says you can only make appropriations for a 2-year period. So the capital budget appropriation money that you may have gotten for a project 2 years ago, if it hasn't been spent yet, that has to be reappropriated every 2 years or it just lapses and you don't get to finish your project. Sometimes capital bill contains reappropriation, sometimes it doesn't. We will see what the General Assembly decides to do about that this year. Another thing, because it's a budget bill, worth remembering is once it gets introduced, whatever's in it, and once it gets passed by the General Assembly and signed by the governor does have line item veto authority in this bill because he can line item veto items, specific items that are in any appropriation containing legislation. So do not make the governor upset during the capital process or your project or language may disappear. The other thing that's worth noting for us, budget geeks that are out there, most budget bills that people think about are immediately effective, meaning they're not subject to the referendum. We can't, go to the ballot and say, we don't like what was passed in there. We want to repeal this. Capital bills are not like that. And there's another arcane constitutional reason for that. And again, you all signed up for a budget seminar on Monday, so you're going to have to listen to, some of these things, but hopefully that this will prove useful to you and your businesses. So the Constitution of Ohio says there's only 3 things that go into effect immediately when the legislature passes them. One is something with an emergency clause, and that means that the General Assembly, by a 2/3 majority in both chambers, says this is an emergency. It can't be subject to referendum. It's immediately effective. The second thing is a tax levy, which, it's unfortunate, but tax levies do go into immediate effect. And then the third thing is budget bills that are for current expenses of the state. When I was starting out my career as the budget guy for the state Senate, capital bills were assumed to go into effect immediately. And a court case challenged that in the 1990s where, somebody wandered in and said, hey, capital expenses aren't for current expenses because they take longer to do. They're buildings, they're not operational. And the Supreme Court of Ohio, in fact, agreed with that argument and said, you know what, person who sued, you're right. These are now 90-day effective date bills. So as this bill gets, the introduction of this bill gets further and further away, unless the General Assembly puts an emergency clause in this, there's still a 90-day effective date issue. So for people that are worried about losing the construction season, if this bill doesn't get introduced in a timely fashion, that's a good thing to be worried about. So I hit a moment ago on our constitutional debt limit. For those of you who are attorneys or actually care about this sort of thing, Article 8 of the Ohio Constitution is what we're allowed to do with bonds and debt. So in 1851, the citizenry of this state said the state cannot have debt beyond $750,000. And you would think, well, that does not seem like a lot. And in fact, it's not a lot. So what has happened in intervening periods of time is the General Assembly has put stuff on the ballot and voters have approved loads of other things that are allowed to be funded with debt of the state. And Beyond that $750,000 casual debt limit, we can now fund public schools, public higher education, certain types of development projects, local public infrastructure from the Public Works Commission, Parks and Rec, natural resources, conservation, revitalization, veterans bonuses. No joke, all of those things were separate constitutional amendments that had to be approved between today and 1851. So according to budget management, because I'm the kind of person who would call and ask them this, how many amendments have been approved allowing, certain types of debt? They say since 1921, there have been at least 20 additional constitutional amendments authorizing general obligation debt, which are full faith and credit bonds. And that's just a fancy way of saying that the taxes of the state are backing this debt. So before the state can spend money on anything, the debt service of these bonds has to be paid. So I'm going to try to share my screen here and show you what the capital bill has paid for in years past. And of course, the screen that I need is once again not coming up. That is annoying to me, but I'm going to show you, hopefully right now, a document that shows what funds are not, or what types of projects can't be funded by state bonds. Tony, can you confirm that there is a document being shown? Okay, so this is something in 2015 or so. I kind of revised this when I was getting ready to leave the Senate to go to Ohio State. Now OBM includes this very helpfully in their capital guidance. So for community projects, the things that are not state projects, here's the list of things you are not supposed to fund with state bond money. And as you look through this list, you will see an awful lot of things that you'll probably say, well, Perera, some of those things have been in the state capital budget, because I recall there being local libraries or airports or county facilities or whatever. And you're right. And again, I'll explain in a moment why that is. So in the state current capital budget we're living in right now, this was House Bill 687 that passed in 2022. The state made somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.5 billion in capital appropriations. That's an awful lot. And about 2.2 billion of that was new debt. The rest of it came from sources that are not usually in the capital budget, like federal stimulus dollars that were still out there from the end of COVID, that sort of thing. But most of the funding in the capital bill, more than 90% of it, goes to state agencies. So things like Public Works Commission, Department of Natural Resources, Facilities Construction Commission, which is responsible for the state portion of money that goes into local public school buildings, Rehab and Corrections, Youth Services, Department of Higher Ed, that sort of thing. That sort of thing. So the vast majority of this bill is agency stuff, keeping the assets of the state maintained properly or building new buildings, that sort of thing. What you're going to hear about between, the Senate's request deadline of April 22nd and whenever this bill gets introduced is the community project list. And what that means is the stuff people want to put in that are just, projects that their districts want. So legislators will have a list of things that they submit to Chairman Edwards in the House and Chairman Dolan in the Senate, and they say, I really think this is important. It ought to be funded. So, I mentioned that somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 billion was in the last capital budget. Only about 190 million of that was community projects. But that's, again, what you hear mostly about, because that's, where people are trying to get little projects in their district funded. So, these projects, they have to be bondable. And this is an annoying concept, but that, type of projects that couldn't be funded by state bonds. The reason why this is important is because it's bond money. The state constitution says you can only use that for very limited things. There has to be a nexus to the state of Ohio. And what that means is there has to be a way for the state to say, okay, this is a legitimate thing for public debt to be spent on. And if we're going to spend public debt on this type of thing, we got to make sure that there's a public purpose being served. So when you're looking down this list, I guess I became an enabler when I was doing state budgeting, because, you would like to just say no to a bunch of projects. But, if a member came to me and said, hey, Perera, I want to have funding for a local airport, for example, and it's clearly on the list of things we're not supposed to fund, if there's a state purpose for that airport, it's legit according to the eyes of our Constitution and our statute. So we would have to figure out what is the way to connect that to a state agency or a state university in a way that, makes it a state project. So for example, years ago, when we did improvements at Rickenbacker, which is an airport, it was run through the Air National Guard and the Adjutant General's office of the state. The Adjutant General gets use for that facility for Air National Guard planes, that sort of thing. So you can fund projects that are traditionally not funded so long as there is a nexus to the state. And if you're thinking about, going for capital dollars, here are some things to think about. If these funds are being expended by the state for your project, you then have to treat that money as though it's public. So you have to pay prevailing wage on it. You have to do the appropriate, contract selection processes, that sort of thing. And, in many cases, people will find, gee, this is so cumbersome, I don't really want to do this. And an example of that, I won't tell you the name of the actual project, but we had a theater project that came in. The total project cost was about $10 million. They get $500,000 from the state. They had raised more than $9 million locally of private dollars. And, when it was time for the state to spend $500,000 that had been in the capital budget on this $10 million project, and the project sponsors realized they would have to pay prevailing wage on the entire project, they said, well, this is going to increase the cost of our project by more than the dollar amount we got from the state. And they actually declined the funding. So be aware of the fact that there are things of that sort that have to be done if you take this funding. Another thing that happens frequently, and again, I put on my Ohio State hat for this, projects will get run through state universities. And, this is not a rubber stamp. The state and the Department of Higher Education have to sign off on the nexus to that university being legitimate. So if you have a project that you're going to say, I want to run this through one of the universities or community colleges, you have to make sure that that university or community college can get actual public benefit out of that project, whatever it might be. And then they're required to sign a legally binding joint use agreement for the life of the bond. So you will have a 20-year period where your project, if it's being funded by debt money of the state, has some sort of leaseback arrangement or a joint use agreement with a state agency. So that's, kind of a concern for people who are used to getting earmarks in the operating budget where there are really no strings attached other than what the General Assembly said the requirements were in the budget bill. Capital dollars do have a lot of strings attached. So we have a big capital budget. It's mostly agency funding. There's a component of it that's usually between $150 to $190 million for the 2-year period that's for community projects, and they need to be bondable. So that's sort of the background on how the capital budget works. Now we'll say, take everything that I have just discussed about how a capital budget has worked since 1970 or so and put it on pause, because this cycle, something very different is happening, not just because of scheduling. But this capital budget is very likely to contain cash as opposed to just bond proceeds. In the operating budget, the General Assembly had a lot of leftover capacity with the cash that it had on hand, and it didn't want to build it into the base of state operational expenses because they didn't think some of these revenues were going to recur. So some of the money the state put into funds for one-time spending purposes. And the big one that you will hear people talk about in the next couple of months is the one-time strategic community investments fund, because, the state names things, unmanageable things. People on Cap Square are now calling this OTSCIF. And I know that the finance directors for the House and Senate will be pleased if I call it OTSCIF as well, so I'm going to. But this was a $700 million fund that the General Assembly parked in the operating budget to say, when we do a capital outlay later in this General Assembly, we would like to obligate $700 million of this budget bill to go towards that. So, the fact that there is now a pot of funding that does not have to follow the bondable requirements is very interesting to a lot of people, because things that are traditionally not funded by bond money, like vehicles and, road projects and other things that are traditionally not in there, are now eligible potentially. So, some of the variables that will be out there for this capital budget is if you're asking for a project or your legislators asking for a project or your community is asking for something, somebody at the State House is going to look at that and say, if we fund this, are we going to use traditional capital dollars from state bond proceeds? Are we going to put it in OTSCIF, this cash fund, if we're going to fund it at all? So, having this OTSCIF there means never having to say you're bondable, which is a nice thing. Although, please remember, this is not likely to recur. So, the state had excess capacity last year. My bet is 2 years from now, people are going to go in with a list of projects that are not bondable and say, but you did that last time. Just avoid that pitfall out of the gate so that, you know that this is an unusual occurrence. So some of the questions that people have asked me, and knowing that I was going to do this, they said, hey, Perera, when you're doing this thing for the chamber, will you answer these questions? And I said, yeah, okay, give me a list. So the first, is this bill going to be the traditional agreed to in advanced capital budget? So far, both House and Senate have said that that is their goal. So I hope that that's the case. Although there are 2 bills pending right now that indicate perhaps they haven't quite landed on an agreement. The House passed House Bill 2 a couple of weeks ago that has components of what might be in a full-fledged capital budget later in the year. They have $600 million for school building assistance through the construction or facilities construction commission, $400 million for the Public Works Commission, which is the money that goes to local communities for sewers and roads and bridges and that type of thing. About $400 million for higher education facilities, $250 million for local jail projects, and then the House did allocate $350 million or half of the OTSCIF fund from House Bill 33. So that's House Bill 2 that is sitting out there now. The Senate has not taken action on that bill. However, the Senate passed their own version of a maybe partial capital budget also earlier this year. They amended into House Bill 27 about $200 million for the Exposition Commission. Those are the folks who run the state fairgrounds for the Expo 2050 plan. That's something the governor's been working on to make improvements to the state fairgrounds. They included $600 million for school building assistance as well. They included $575 million for the Public Works Commission, and they also did the reappropriations from the last capital budget. So House Bill 2, pending, awaiting potential Senate action. House Bill 27 went back to the House for a possible concurrence vote that hasn't occurred yet. So, people I think have said to me, which of those are going to pass? Well, again, the House and Senate have said that they would like to come to an agreed to capital budget. Maybe one of those 2 bills will end up being a vehicle. Maybe it will be a completely new bill that has not gotten a number yet that gets introduced that has everything for the state, everything for community projects, and everything for this OTSCIF fund, but we don't know yet. So, stay tuned to legislative endeavors and we will see what happens there. So, the $700 million that's available in cash for this OTSCIF is potentially is in addition to the traditional community project allocation. So some people have said to me, as though I have a crystal ball for this, is the 700 going to be on top of the 150 to 190 million that's usually in the capital budget, or will it take the place of community project funding? Again, I can't guarantee that I know the answer to this question, but I believe that the plan has been there will be community projects funded through the traditional pot of 150 to 190 million of bond funds, plus the 700 million. The appropriators of the General Assembly may decide that that is not what they're going to do, but for now, both chambers have sort of asked people when they are submitting requests, is this bondable or could it go into the cash fund? So it definitely appears as though they're going to do community projects that are cumulative. So the 700 million plus the bond money will be there. Again, up to them to determine if they want to do that. And, the other question I got, sort of going back to when the effective date of this thing is, will this bill pass as an emergency so that, these projects can go into immediate effect and people can use the 2024 calendar year construction season? I don't know the answer to that. And I don't think anybody has a time frame down yet, but I will say this, and I'll kind of work in a story about, what could happen with this. So the traditional capital time frame for this bill to pass is pretty much right now when we're talking about this. You know, the House wanted to do it in kind of the February, March timeframe. The Senate has expressed publicly that it wants to do it in the April, May, June timeframe. That range is pretty usual. It's usually the first 6 months of this even numbered calendar year that capital bills pass. However, I will say in the 11 budget cycles that I was the budget director for the state Senate, there were several capital bills that for whatever reason got delayed until November, December. People would say, let's do this after a general election that takes place. We don't have time to do this. We need to be back in our districts. The state needs to get its, plans together for what the agency funding will look like. So we could have a capital budget that is, between now and June. Again, that's the legislature still suggesting that's what would happen. We could have a capital budget that is November, December, if things get dragged out and they can't decide. And then Tony and I talked about this. I'm uncomfortable even bringing this story up, but it happened in real life. So I think I probably ought to remind people of this. In the 125th General Assembly, this was back in 2003, 2004. So this would have been towards the end of 2004. Doug White was the Senate president and Larry Householder was the House Speaker. And they tried to kind of cobble together a capital bill in this traditional March, April, May, June timeframe, couldn't get it done, planned on doing one in the November, December timeframe, and the House and Senate were not in agreement on things. And the two legislative leaders were kind of at each other's throats. And Doug White went into one of the final sessions of the Senate for that year. This is again November, December of 2004, and announced that he was going to sine die adjourn the Senate, meaning ending all the Senate business for the year, closing out the General Assembly. Speaker Householder was dismayed to hear that because a capital budget had not been passed, and the Senate adjourned. So what ended up happening was the capital budget that should have taken place in the 125th General Assembly got done in January of the following General Assembly. And then the regular capital bill for that 2-year cycle also happened in the 126th. So if you're pouring back through the state history saying, why in the hell was there a House Bill 16 as a capital budget in the 126th, and then there was a separate capital bill later? It's because a leadership disagreement pushed the capital budget over the line into the next General Assembly. Could that happen this year? I have not heard anybody suggest that it will, but I point out to everyone that that has occurred in real life since we've been, paying attention to this stuff. So, right now we have a circumstance where if you have a project that you're trying to seek funding for, and there's a timeliness element to it, if it's passed in, May or June, and then there's a 90-day effective date, you may still be able to do some construction this year. If it's passed in November, December, or January, you may have to change your plans a little bit. So, that is probably a decent overview of what goes into this. Tony, I know that there were a lot of people before this who said, hey, Perera, I'm probably going to anonymously ask you some questions on this. So I am happy to take any questions or even, give strategy if people are looking for ways to get things included. So you tell me, Tony, has anybody bothered to turn in chat questions on this or not?
No, we just have a comment of Doug White, Great American.
So, very good. Very good. Okay.
I do have a question for you. When I first started at the Ohio Chamber, we were debating whether or not to add taxes to the fuel tax to help with the transportation budget. I think the previous administration, didn't they do some bonding to get over some revenue humps? And does that bonding add to the 5% cap, which then impacts the capital budget as well?
That's a great question. Because the funding that you're talking about is transportation related, that's actually separate. So when we think about general obligations of the state being paid for by, income and commercial activity and sales tax, transportation budget bonds are paid for with the money that you and I pay for our driver's licenses, the money that we pay in gas tax and diesel tax, and the money that we pay, for driver's licenses, license plates. So it's a separate pot of money. So when bond funds that are used for, by the way, there's also an enormous amount of federal money that comes in for transportation projects as well that's funded by federal gas tax and fuel tax revenues. That it is a separate calculation. It's not considered general obligation in the same capacity, but you bring up the previous administration did something with bonds there. Yes. So what the Kasich administration did was they decided that they didn't want to raise gas tax to the extent that, there's always a laundry list of projects people want to fund through the transportation advisory committees that can't get on the list because there are way more requests than there is available cash. So the Kasich administration actually used some of the Turnpike Commission proceeds to back debt to be used on road projects beyond the Turnpike. So that is a separate pot of money. If you're bored enough to go on the OBM website and look at all of their capital expenditures, you will see that there are defeasance streams for those bonds as well. So that's a good question, but transportation budget is separate in this state, and in a way, it's a very good thing that it is because when you think about the money in Ohio that comes in for road purposes, this gas tax and licensure fees, they are constitutionally required to be spent only on road projects. So unlike other states that commingle all their funds and spend things, as though all the money comes from the same place, Ohio has been very sage, I think, in keeping their budgets for that sort of thing separate. It's the same as the workers' compensation budget being separate. The money that is paid in by employers for worker medical costs is kept separate because that shouldn't be commingled with the operating budget and used for other purposes. So our Constitution has protected us from ourselves in many cases, and that would be an example.
Okay. The question on maybe crystal ball question, language or policy changes being added to the Capitol bill this time. There's been some fights in interchamber and intra-chamber, slipping in maybe a policy change or language to this bill. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Well, and that's effectively what caused that lawsuit in the 90s, where somebody went in and said, I can't believe I can't referendum this thing that the General Assembly put into the capital budget just because it's a budget bill. And, the court agreed with that and said, yeah, you're right. This is all going to be subject to referendum now because it's not current expense. House and Senate leaders, as well as the Finance Committee folks, have said publicly over the last few months that they would like to do what they are saying is a clean capital bill, meaning that they would like to keep whatever, if it ends up being House Bill 2, if it ends up being House Bill 27, if it ends up being House or Senate Bill XXX to be introduced later, the indication at the moment seems to be that, they want to have this, they want the agency and community project funds to be in there, and potentially the reappropriation dollars as well, but they do not want language. So at this point, it sounds like what they're going to do is have, appropriation line items, and maybe there's always language that goes with the appropriations to make sure they're spent properly. But it, at the moment, does not sound like they're going to have big policy decisions in there that involve permanent law language. Now, Tony, you and I have been around here long enough where we see if there is a problem with passing this bill because people don't like the spending or their projects didn't get funded or whatever the case may be, in order to get votes, do they need to include language on some things? That's how that's happened in years past. And, the other thing about the capital budget is, like most budget bills, even though this one's not constitutionally required to be passed in any certain time frame like the operating budget bill is, there's an expectation this General Assembly will pass something. Whatever the time frame is, they will pass a capital bill because you need to have, maintenance dollars for state facilities. If they need to get votes and they are having trouble, there's a possibility that language goes in, and that, could be anything that is, according to the Constitution, germane to the underlying bill. Germaneness is in the eye of the beholder, so we'll see. But, I have not heard, I'd be interested if anybody on this call has heard language issues that people might want to enact, because, the one thing I could think of that is, not sure if I'd say it's germane, but it's closely related to this, is limitations on real property taxes. And, because capital appropriations, you are allowed to use those to purchase real property, there could be some that make the case that some of the curbs they're trying to put on unfettered real property tax growth would be germane to this. I haven't heard that yet, but it wouldn't surprise me.
And kind of a follow-up to that, let's say this runs closer to lame duck. That's when you could probably see an unclean version of this get done, right?
That could happen. I mean, one of the things that, I'm going to get into, this is going to be a geeky budget comment here, but you know, you've asked for it. So
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
reappropriations, the leftover capital money
Yeah,
from the last capital bill,
right.
if they do not pass a reappropriations bill by July 1 with an emergency clause in it, you will have projects lapse. And that
Okay.
means projects that are out there being built, they're going to put plastic over them and say, we don't have the spending authority to do any more of this. So I believe between now and the summer, the state will pass at least the reappropriations component of the capital budget. And again, knock on wood, hopefully with an emergency clause. But you're right. If the new stuff, the new 2 billion or whatever it might be for state projects, and then the 7 to 8 to 900 million in community projects between cash and bonds, if it the longer this runs, and the closer you get to lame duck with people trying to pass things right before the General Assembly ends, I think it increases the odds of other things being included. But time will tell on that. It may also lead to people saying, here's a capital bill with nothing else in it, take it or leave it, and throwing that out there. So I'd be interested if there are people on this call who have specific things that they think they want to see in a capital bill that's language related. I'd be interested to hear. I think most people are probably concerned that poison pills that we don't like could get in there, but you never know.
But you said earlier that does the governor have line item veto on this bill? So,
He does. Any bill that contains an appropriation, even if
okay,
it's not in the appropriations section, the governor could go in and use his authority to red pen and excise some things out there. However, this, General Assembly, for those on the call that have, maybe not been paying attention to this, the General Assembly did override a line item veto of something that had been in the operating budget. So,
mhm.
the General Assembly took very seriously the stuff that had put into House Bill 33 to the extent that they used their supermajority veto override. So, the governor could line item veto, but the threat is always, of course, out there that if the General Assembly liked enough what they put into that bill, they could come back and revisit it.
So we're in for interesting times if we
I,
don't get
I,
something done by June.
I think that's right. And again, right now, I think everybody is rowing forward with the expectation of trying to get something done before summer, but that's by no means guaranteed at this point.
Okay. And then kind of a question out there on if you have a community project, what's the best way to bubble it up to caps? Is it through your House member, your Senate member? Do you go through
So
your local chamber, then they can talk to that member?
So, I mean, to your point, a lot of local entities like chambers or, business community groups got together and sort of said, hey, let's look at what's going on and try to prioritize. And that process for this cycle has happened,
Right.
because the House's requests were due in January. And, that's a great way to start, is make sure that local community leaders and business leaders are in agreement that what you are doing is vital to the community. Then most people go to their state representative and their state senator and say, hey, Senator X and Representative Y, I've got this thing. I'd like you to consider requesting this. If it's a regional project, Project Central Ohio has this quite often where, there are 16 or 17 members of the General Assembly that will be interested in the project, or it's multi-county. Talking to all of those representatives and senators is a good idea. And, some projects are even statewide in import. So talking to your local delegation to get them to request it to the chair's offices is important. But the other thing I think is worth doing, if you've got the time and inclination to be supportive of a project, is talk to members on the finance committee as well, because they're the ones who will be deciding what goes in there and whispering in the ear of Chair Edwards and Chair Dolan, hey, this is important to me, and telling Speaker Stevens and President Huffman these are important. The more this was, as a budget guy, it was always easier for us to fund something if a lot of different members had requested it.
Okay.
Because if I have a limited amount of resources,
Yeah.
and I can make 60 members of the House and 25 members of the Senate, for example, happy with that request, I could check the box and say, all right, with this one project, I am satisfying the request of many different members of the General Assembly. The other thing that's a good thing to do is check in with the governor's legislative folks as well, because oftentimes they will consider putting their thumb on the scale for community projects. And if you have their support, that doesn't hurt either.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Do we have any other questions out there?
And I
So
know,
far,
you guys have an income tax thing coming up here at 1. So people
yeah,
who have signed up for that have really, gluttons for punishment. They're taking a bunch of state issues, directly. But honestly, this is one of these things where I probably get more phone calls about how to do things in the capital budget than anything else that comes across my desk. And that was true at Ohio State, and it was true when I worked for the Senate, and it's true now. So, if people have questions that they didn't want to ask on this call of, hey, I've got this thing that's really, I'm embarrassed to ask for it because I'm not sure if it's fundable or I'm not sure what agency it would go through. Feel free to they can give me a call here at ZHF as well. I'm happy to answer questions.
appreciate that. Yeah, I think this is one. I mean, we don't often talk about the capital budget, but I think it's probably one of the most impactful locally bills that gets worked on, even though we really like to talk about the operating budget. But this capital budget can do a lot of, just a dollar here or there can get something over the finish line that may not have gotten done in our community. So,
well, and you've seen, in local news reports recently, there are discussions about very large projects that are seeking funding in Ohio. And again, because there's cash that's involved with this bill rather than just bond money, things that are more economic development and workforce related than traditional higher education projects could be funded. There are things that could go to, projects that are regional or even statewide in scope that can help with our workforce shortage. You've probably heard people are looking for facilities for, sporting events. People are looking for facilities for convention purposes. This will be interesting, not just because of the dollars being spent, but the types of dollars are allowing non-traditional projects to get into the mix.
yeah. So, yeah, I think we're in for some interesting language, some interesting timing, and we'll just see how all that plays out. So, one last shout out for questions from anyone. I don't see any. I think they're all being shy. They'll probably call you as soon as this is over.
Yeah, that's okay. I just, these are competing projects. There's a finite amount of resources, even as much as is available for this year, and there's a roughly infinite amount of requests. So make your case, show why, what your community or your project will do for the greater good, and there's still time to try to get some stuff included here, but the clock's running regardless of when the legislature decides to do this.
Yep. Yeah. And before we go, one last kind of geeky question. Was the 700 million a way to avoid some of the other things ticked off in the operating budget that you're supposed to do with excess funding?
Yeah, this is, again, we're jumping back to the operating budget of last year, but the state now has a rainy day fund that's somewhere in excess of $3.5 billion. Right. Part of, excess funds goes to that. It's very close to, where that would be. Looking back on one of the reasons the legislature did the OTSCIF was it didn't want state agencies, say I'm Department of Medicaid or I'm the Department of Education and Workforce, to say, we know you have extra capacity. Can you give us more in terms of our operating expenses? Well, if the state doesn't think this revenue is going to recur, then they're going to build a spending base that's too high for 2 years from now. And then they'll either have to cut or ask for more taxes, both of which are not particularly popular. So the state actually put aside at the end of the budget bill close to $5.5–6 billion in sort of excess cash that was there.
Wow.
Some of it went to the rainy day fund. Some of it went to the governor's All Ohio Future Fund. Some of it we talked about went to the one-time strategic community investment fund that Speaker Huffman was a fan of. Nearly $500 million of it went to local transportation projects. That was something that Speaker Stevens wanted. And, there was an awful lot of funding that was put into more capital seeming one-time expenses that do not recur, so that they don't get themselves into spending trouble. It was a pretty good usage of funds. But that's why this happens. So again, I don't think you can count on it recurring, but
no, absolutely not. You don't want to fund a program that you're going to have to stop in a year because you don't have any more money.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Brian, for your time, and we'll let people get back to their lunch hour. And if you have any questions, you can reach Brian at ZHF Consulting. And thanks again for joining us for the Ohio Chambers Business Academy. Thanks,
All right,
Brian.
and hope everybody's switching over to the income tax thing at one, because that's going to be good info as well.
Thanks, Brian.
See ya.
Bye now.